Good evening.
Good evening.
Blessing of the Lord be upon you.
We bless you in the name of the Lord.
Thank you very much. Tonight, we'll talk about the ideal education. Luke chapter 2, verses 40 through 52. A rather long reading to start off with, but it's good. It deals with the passage, and we'll keep some of these things in mind for what we're going to talk about in the lesson. And the child, speaking about Jesus, grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Okay? A little aside here, not teaching them.
Right.
Not teaching them, listening to them and asking them questions. And all were amazed, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And in other words, the questions that he had, they would answer, and then he would kind of repeat the answer in his words with more questions, and they were just amazed at the depth of his understanding, of how he understood some of the, what shall we say, hard things that they were teaching. Verse 48, and when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. And he said to them, Why were you looking for me? 3 days. And the last place they look is the temple, which should have been the first place that they would look. Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? And I think some translations will even say about my Father's business. Verse 50, and they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. That will be the basis of our lesson this evening as we look at the ideal education. Because Luke portrays Jesus as the perfect man. Perfect man. So we want to look at the 4 ways Jesus grew to become our perfect example. If he's the perfect man, then he is our perfect example. Whether we're male or female, it doesn't make any difference. He's the perfect example. Number 1, Jesus grew in wisdom, which means he grew intellectually. Intellectually. Now listen, you can have knowledge. There are people who have knowledge about a lot of things, but they don't have the wisdom to put the knowledge to use to make it profitable to them. Wisdom is taking knowledge and putting it into practice so that it kind of turns out to be good or useful, having a utility, not a futility. I mean, people who are supposed to be smart, we see them all the time, and they're like idiots. They don't know how to do anything like run a country, run the military, all of that stuff. It's amazing, right? Oh, we got them out of the academic world. Oh, you should have got somebody who was in the energy industry, if you want them in the energy department, or somebody who's a farmer for agriculture, or something of that nature. But one of the funny things that we have with television, every now and then comedians will do people on the street interviews, and they'll go out and they'll ask them questions, like basic things. Like all the old, was who's buried in Grant's tomb? It's like half the people don't know. You get all kinds of crazy answers, and some people don't know who's the first president of the United States, and just basic things like that. And but I even talk about it sometimes with the church. The quote Romans chapter 1 verse 16, not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. And I say, well, what's the power of God unto salvation? Oh, prayer. Oh, it's this or that or whatever. No, read that. What does it say there? Well, the gospel is the power of God to salvation. But sometimes people just don't make the connection that they need. Jesus was able to make connections. Now, he had to learn to read and write. And we know that he could read and write. How do we know that he could read and write? Well, one of the first things talked about when he grew up was he went into the synagogue, and what they did, he got the scroll, they gave it to him, and he found the place, and he read a passage. Later on, he writes in the dust in the temple, right? We know he can read and write. He learned the history of his people, the nation of Israel. And we talked about that this morning, didn't we? About the stories, how important they are. If you're going to have a culture, you've got to know where you came from. You can't have a culture that's kind of a blend of Heinz 57. It just comes from everywhere. Take a little bit of here, a little bit of there, No, a culture is something that is developed over time. And at the time of Jesus, there was about 4,000 years of history and culture that these people had. Now, some of it was bad, right? And studying the minor prophets, we get that impression. But a lot of it was good for those who followed the Lord. So he learned the history of his people, the nation of Israel, and probably learned the current events as he listened to people talk about Rome. And we still talk about the Roman Empire, don't we? Maybe not like we should, but how'd you like to have lived through the Roman Empire? What a time that would have been. It was world-changing. But he listened to people, and he probably understood the politics of it. But he probably also understood the prophecies of the Old Testament about the Roman Empire and what was going on and what the times were. Attending synagogue, he learned of God's covenant with Israel. Seems like he didn't miss too many church services. He knew what the scriptures taught. And probably from the Essene preachers, he would learn about the times and season at hand. We don't talk too much about the Essenes. I haven't talked to you very much about the Essenes. But it's quite possible that John, the immerser, had grown up among the Essenes, who were a group of people who were called the people of God, or the ones who were looking for the kingdom. Early in the gospel accounts, talks about people who were looking for the kingdom to come. It meant they recognized the signs of the times, that this is the time for the kingdom to come. And a lot of those are the Essenes. You go back and look at some of the material that's left in the that's awful, Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, you have a lot of their writings and stuff that are there and what they were teaching and what they believed. And, of course, they were considered a cult, but they were probably closer because they were actually rejecting the temple and what was going on at the temple. Much like Jesus, when he comes and he upsets the money changers' tables and drives out the animals and so. This is my Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of thieves. So he probably learned a lot from them also. But that didn't stop him from going to the synagogue. John went out to the wilderness, but Jesus was there among the people. Okay? He learned the geography of his part of the world for sure. Traveled much in his early life. Going down to Jerusalem all the time for those feasts and whatever. I was watching, or was it on TV or something on the internet, maybe it was just an article, but there's somebody talking about Jesus and said he never traveled more than 100 miles from his home. Well, that's baloney, because when he was about 2 years old, his family took him to Alexandria, Egypt, to get away from Herod. So yeah, he traveled more than 100 years. So some people just don't read the Bible. They don't read the scriptures. They want this preconceived notion of Jesus of being almost like John the Immerser. And he's backwater, backwoods, doesn't know anything, rose up, No, Jesus was intellectually wise. He knew these things. He understood. And he was probably walking and talking by the time Joseph and Mary took him to Egypt. Because it was about 2 years before the wise men got to Jerusalem to talk to Herod. Where's this new king of the Jews? Where is he? He understood things about nature and science. You think about the parables that he told, the analogies that were there, the parable of the sower. All of those things, they came from somewhere, didn't they? He realized what was out there in the physical world and then was able to make a connection to say, now this is what the spiritual world is like, so people could understand what the spiritual world was like. He could teach the truths about God and salvation from the truths of nature and science, which, Proverbs 23:23 says, buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. Buy it. Buy it. Put some money in it. And you all know the value of getting an education. Getting that teaching certificate, getting that degree, getting the master's degree. But, there you go. He grew in wisdom. He also grew in stature, which means he grew physically. Now, parents become anxious if their children don't grow average or above average according to the doctor's statistical chart, right? Mama takes the baby, to the doctor, and the doctor measures the baby and weighs the baby. Oh, he's a little bit behind average. Oh no, my child is not average. It's just, what are we going to do? And dads do it too. Yeah. And, now sometimes, there are physical or there are diseases, there are actual problems there, but lots of times, how in the world do you get an average if you don't have some that are below average? I mean, that's just where it's at. But he did grow in stature, physically. What are some of the reasons? Well, number one, he ate right. The Jews had their dietary laws coming from the Bible. They were very strict, but you know what? They were very healthful. And even some people today are going back to that and saying, I'm getting rid of some of this. Well, some of that for them wasn't for health reasons, it was to teach them something. It was to teach them something. But yeah, nothing wrong with eating right. He got plenty of exercise. People of Jesus' day worked hard, especially people up around Nazareth. And they say, most people say it was a carpenter. Well, the word that's used there is like a craftsman, and it's more likely that he dealt in stone. That he and Joseph would go over to Capernaum, say, and build stone buildings. Can you imagine lifting stones and putting them in place? Imagine like guys who lay blocks, cement blocks for a living today. That's pretty strenuous work. So they worked hard. Everywhere they went, what did they do? They walked. They walked, And if you're lucky enough to have a donkey, you might ride your donkey. But most of the time they walked. And if they walked to Jerusalem, they would walk 75 miles because they would go the long way around to avoid the Samaritans. But they walked. They got the exercise. He did not drink excessively. He did not use tobacco products. He didn't use illicit drugs. Find that nowhere in the scriptures, right? So he was treating his body right. He found time to rest, right? There are times, hey, he withdrew himself, went to the mountains and brought his apostles, hey, we got to take a break here. Rested, he meditated, and he prayed. So 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 and 20, Paul says, now this is in connection to sexual misconduct, all right? But I think it applies in general to a lot of things. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. In other words, don't do harm to your body. And so that's what the sexual misconduct, sexual sin would do, would harm the body. But other people like to apply other things to it. You don't do that. You're not, as a Christian, you can't do that because you're going to hurt your body. Well, guess what? You're taking a risk driving a car. You're taking a risk walking across the street. There's a whole lot of things that really that doesn't apply to. Okay? It's not applicable to it. But there are other things that are applicable to it. And we got to be, here's the word, wise enough to make the right choices on those things. Okay? So we'll leave it at that. He grew in stature. He grew in wisdom. He grew in stature. And he grew in favor with God, which means he grew spiritually. Our reading showed Jesus in the temple learning from the religious leaders. It just wasn't, he listened to them and he parroted. He listened to them and went through it in his mind to get his mind wrapped around what they were teaching so that he could ask the next question and reformulate that back. And they were amazed at how he was able to do that, right? And there are a lot of people today that think if they just read the Bible, well, if I read a chapter a day, then I'm studying my Bible. No, that's not Bible study, reading a chapter a day. Bible study is digging in it and making applications throughout. So that's what Jesus did, and that's why he could grow spiritually more than, say, even his brothers and sisters who rejected him at first. Jesus attended worship services regularly in his hometown synagogue. Luke chapter 3, verse 16, that was his custom. And when we say custom, what does that mean? What was 21 times doing something to make a habit? I don't think it takes that many to break a habit, but it takes a lot to make it a habit, a custom. but he let nothing keep him from worshiping God. And Jesus took part in the worship services, because there in Luke chapter 3, what is he doing? He's reading from the scriptures. And listen, not only is he reading from the scriptures, what does he do? He gives the correct interpretation of it. And that's what people get upset. That's why they got upset. He said that today, this passage is fulfilled in your hearing. And they said, what? Who are you? And they took him out. They were going to stone him to death. His own fellow townsman. How can you say such a thing? But he did. He gave the correct interpretation of it. And even though he was the Son of God, he still worshiped, studied, prayed, and served like we also are taught to do. Even after his baptism, and then the Holy Spirit comes upon him, he begins to do miracles. He's still worshiping. He's still studying. He's still praying. He's still serving. Psalm 127 and verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. That's the spiritual nature of us, right? Unless the Lord is building our spiritual nature, unless we're allowing Him to build it, it's going to be in vain. Unless we allow Him to be the watchman, say, for us, it's in vain. We're going to be overtaken. And that's a lot of how we can grow spiritually also. Let Him be the watchman. Let Him be the builder of our lives. Jesus grew in the favor of men, which means He grew socially. Socially. And this is a tough one. It's a tough one for me. But somebody said it's not so much how many friends you got, but the friends that you do have get to be close friends, right? And, you know, that's kind of true. You give everybody an opportunity, but it's hard to get close to some people. Very difficult. Now, the early church, you know, of course, they were there. They had a lot of common things going on. It says in Acts chapter 2 and verse 47, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So even the early church was able to do that in the Spirit of Christ, having favor with all the people, socially. Okay, and that had to be tough in Jerusalem with all those Jewish people around who pretty soon they were going to be the enemies. See, when they were there helping everybody and just talking to everybody, not causing too much trouble, everybody liked them. But when they started really telling them, hey, you got to change. This temple is going to be destroyed. Got to be a lot of trouble. Now, growing in favor of men does not mean that Jesus ever failed to obey God for the reason just to please men. Okay? No, He didn't do that. In fact, we see that there were times when He displeased men because that was the right thing to do in order to obey God. It means that Jesus, in His service to mankind, found appreciation from those whom He served. There were some people that He healed that probably did not become Christians, did not follow Him, but they appreciated Him. Even Pilate, you think about that, Pontius Pilate. I find no fault in this man. But there it was. He went to the cross anyway. Jesus was a helper, not a herder, and that's that concept of agape love, isn't it? To be a helper, not a herder. The Bible speaks of people such as Mary Magdalene, Matthew the publican, a tax collector, Paul, who was Saul, a persecutor of the church. The lives of these people and millions more were changed by Jesus. Changed. You talk about somebody that would have to be difficult to change your life. It would have been Saul of Tarsus. He was set to destroy the church. He was probably there when Jesus was crucified. But he changed. It's not just knowing about Jesus, but knowing him like a friend, really, like our dearest friend, because he truly is and what he's done for us. In Matthew 5:13-16, Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth. If salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory not to you, but to your Father who is in heaven." Yeah. For what the Father has been able to accomplish for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus grew to adulthood and began preaching the gospel at the age of about 30, which, if we really look at it, he was probably in 26, he was probably about 32, 33 when he started preaching, about 36, almost 37 when he was crucified. He did not grow physically only, or intellectually only, or socially only, or spiritually only. All of them together in every area of life he grew and he matured. And Luke records his life as the picture of what? The perfect man. And if he's the perfect man, then you know what else he is? He's our perfect example. So if we would be perfect, and that's meaning completely mature, grown up as we would, then we would grow in these four areas also. So please do not neglect to grow spiritually, because that's the one element that most of the people in the world do neglect. They don't have any problem getting a good education and just go back here. And how many people do you know that they get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, get down to the gym to exercise, lift weights and whatever, and they grow in favor of people because they're political backslappers, hey, do you ever watch Congress? See I was watching, because the little thing on YouTube said Congress was voting, the House of Representatives was voting on something, and I wanted to see what they were voting on. And I watched for most of the vote, and then I fast forwarded to get to the end of the vote. And I know that they passed something, but never found out what they were voting on. But as I'm sitting there watching as the voting is going on, what are they doing? They're all backslapping one another. I don't trust any of them. But there's the important thing, that we grow spiritually, because he is our perfect example. We don't want to neglect that. Without God in our lives, we can never truly be educated. So that's why I talk about the ideal education, putting it all together. Oh, it's time to quit already. Time flies when we're having fun. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you have a need, let your request be made known as we stand and sing the invitation song.